program. My name is Ted Gong. I am the Executive Director of the 1882 Foundation. It is my role to welcome you to this panel, and I am especially happy to do this because it is essentially organized by young people who were summer interns for our 1882 Foundation just a few months ago. They conceived and carry out new formats to discuss important topics such as being addressed this hour. And it is gratifying to know that there are young people, a generation or even two generations before many of the historians that are in the panels in this conference today. And it's good to know that they are engaged and creative about how the recording and telling of our histories can be adapted to the challenging circumstances and the promising technologies that we face today. Each of the panelists will be introduced as they come on. Susan Lee, who is managing this panel, is an undergraduate student of political science, economics, and anthropology. She is studying at Columbia University in New York. Now, before passing the program to Susan, I do want to say again that the COVID situation impacted the Foundation's programs considerably. So much of what we were doing was dependent on in-person conferencing, presentations, and research. But the online platform that has zoomed into its place has also added greater opportunities. I do hope we have a chance to hear from you all in the ways that you have adapted to the new norm of digital platforms. Another factor that had impacted us as much as did the COVID situation, so the COVID challenges, I would like to mention, for the purpose of remembrance and explanation, the killing of our brother George Floyd and the advent of the Black Lives Matter movement. I do believe that the solidarity with BLA movement compels us to use our platforms to draw more directly and to articulate more clearly the linkages of our historical topics and today's political and social issues. This consideration led directly to us establishing the Timeless Echoes series. And to explain further and to guide the rest of the program, I pass over to Susan Lee.
Hi, everyone. Such a pleasure to be here with you all today. Thank you to Ted for that introduction to the conference organizers and team, to our panelists, and to all of you in the audience. As Ted said, my name is Susan, and I'm an associate with the 1882 Foundation. And I actually joined as an intern over the summer. So the concept of Timeless Echoes was born in June in the midst of the coronavirus pandemic. I'm sure we all remember very well the powerful psychological dread, the isolation and the anxiety that spread all around the nation and the world while we were in lockdown. And this was also a particularly challenging time for those of us who are coded as Asian or Asian American in this country, as we saw the rise of hate crimes, xenophobia, and bigoted rhetoric, not only in these isolated incidents of violence, but also sanctioned at the very highest levels of government. For instance, as we heard President Donald Trump repeatedly framing COVID-19 as, quote, the Chinese virus or the Kung flu. Because we're still in the midst of this pandemic and it is unprecedented in so many ways in the scale and scope of how it's affected American life, I think it's tempting to think of these recent patterns of violence as historical aberrations. And of course, as many of you know, and as we'll discuss today, history bleeds into the present, history echoes, and then even when we're on the other side of history, we're constantly producing history so that what we think we know about the past shapes how we view ourselves and what features we make possible. So one of the things that we wanted to do with the Timeless Echoes series was to highlight the continuity between the past and the present so that we can learn from the past, from how those who came before us confronted or failed to confront bigotry, and understand better how race and violence are constructed and how they operate in this country. This last point leads into, as Ted mentioned, our other major inspiration for the Timeless Echoes series. As I mentioned, Timeless Echoes was conceived back in June in the midst of the national uprising and movement for Black lives that was sparked by the murder of George Floyd. All around the country, we saw mass action, protests, and conversations about systemic racism unfolding in the classroom, at home, and in the workplace. And at the 1882 Foundation, we became increasingly aware of the role that we could play in fostering productive discourses around community solidarity and mobilizing in support of Black lives. Our primary mission is to foster historical education. But of course, history making and educating on history, who we focus on and who's in the periphery, those are all political projects. And we sort of saw this gap in the Asian American community discourses, where there are a lot of fantastic APIA orgs working on the political education and mobilization side, often orgs that are sort of on the younger side. And then there are APIA orgs that focus more on cultural history. And so we see Timeless Echoes as a way for us to sort of bridge the two and think through the politics of memory, which are so critical to shaping our world today, and yet so behind the scenes often. And sometimes that means reckoning with some really challenging questions, like how do we grapple with the failures of various historical movements for social justice? And then given how dense these questions are, we also chose to be quite deliberate in selecting panelists and scholars for these events. So whereas our talk story events are usually more focused around community building and sharing stories, these might be a little bit more academic, but nonetheless, we do this with the aim of making history and scholarship accessible to a wider audience. And we've been quite pleased with the outcomes of that. So despite the challenges of COVID-19, the new virtual medium and Zoom format means that more people from different generations, backgrounds, and locations have been tuning into our events. So we held this viral racism panel that you will see in just a moment back in June. And unfortunately, that topic is still as relevant today as it was a few months ago. We curated the panel so that we have a multitude of different perspectives coming in. So Dr. Audrey Wu Clark brings in a background in English and Asian American literature, and Dr. Janelle Wong from political science. Dr. Adrian Poon is actually a medical doctor working on the front lines of the coronavirus response, and Yilin Zhang, who's our moderator for the panel, has a background in public health. So with that said, I'm going to turn things over to Dr. Audrey Wu Clark for this next section of the panel. Dr. Wu Clark is an associate professor of English at the United States Naval Academy, where she specializes in Asian American and multi-ethnic literature. She has published in a number of academic journals, including AmerAsia and the Asian American Literary Review, and anthologies of literary criticism, most recently in ones published by Oxford University Press and forthcoming by Cambridge University Press. Her book, The Asian American Avant-Garde, Universalist Aspirations in Modernist Literature and Art, was published by Temple University Press in 2015. A daughter of Chinese immigrants, she received her AB from Cornell University and her PhD from the University of California, Berkeley. Without further ado, here is Audrey on the subject of viral racism in the COVID-19 pandemic and before.
Thank you, Susan, for that lovely introduction. And thank you again, Ted and May and Stan, for this opportunity to talk again. And it's wonderful to be working again with Janelle, Yilin, and Adrienne on this topic. I'm going to share my screen so you can see my PowerPoint. It's very small. Viral racism during and before the age of COVID-19. Hate crimes toward Asian Americans have been on the rise in the United States since President Trump called the coronavirus the China virus on Twitter and during press conferences throughout March of 2020. The coronavirus is a highly contagious virus that causes the COVID-19 disease, a deadly respiratory disease that started in Wuhan, China in 2019, but has spread to many other nations and has created a global pandemic in 2020. After Trump ethnically labeled the virus as the Chinese virus or the China virus, 3 members of an Asian American family, including a toddler and a 6-year-old, were stabbed by a white American teenager who believed they were Chinese and spreading the coronavirus in Midland, Texas on March 14, 2020. On April 5, 2020, an Asian woman in Brooklyn was assaulted with acid by an unknown assailant, resulting in chemical burns on her face and body. Trump called the coronavirus the Kung flu at his Tulsa, Oklahoma rally on June 20th, 2020, and reiterated blame on China for the virus ever since. Thereafter, on July 4th, an Asian American family from the San Francisco Bay Area was stopped on a hike by a white woman who told them they can't be in this country. Likewise, on July 7th, San Francisco Bay Area tech company Solid 8 CEO Michael Lofthouse yelled at an Asian American family in a restaurant, "F you Asians, go back to whatever effing Asian country you're from, and you don't belong here." With constant news and social media reports of anti-Asian sentiment during the 2020 COVID-19 outbreaks, people around the world have been shocked at the discursive transformation of Asians and Asian Americans from the model minority to the yellow peril. The stereotype of the model minority was coined in 1966 by sociologist William Peterson in the New York Times Magazine, a year after the U.S. passed its Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965, which solicited the immigration of white-collar immigrants from Asia. However, this talk traces the model minority discourse back to the 19th century and points out that the tandem stereotypes of the yellow peril and the model minority have existed in the United States for centuries, but surface in crises such as global pandemics. This essay traces these stereotypes to the early era of U.S. exclusion legislations directed toward Asian Americans in the 19th century, beginning with the establishment of the Anti-Coolie Association in 1869, the Massacre of 1871, in which 18 Chinese men were lynched in Los Angeles, the Page Act of 1875, which prohibited the immigration of Chinese women based on the assumption that they were all prostitutes, and the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which prevented the immigration of the Chinese because they were deemed aliens ineligible to citizenship. I consider these four organizational and legal events that constitute the early Asian exclusion era in the United States as various forms of figurative and literal lynchings, insofar as Asians and Asian Americans are viewed as objectified and disposable bodies. This view perpetuates the other invisibly privileged objectification of white Americans as healthy, perfect, and supreme. The beginnings of the term yellow peril are unclear. Some scholars argue that it was generated by the fear of Mongolian invasions of Europe from 1236 to 1291. Various sources trace the term yellow peril to Russian sociologist Jacques Nabokov. Critic Richard Austin Thompson claims, quote, as early as 1871, however, Bakunin, father of the anarchist school of socialists, was reported to have set forth the yellow peril idea at a Geneva peace conference. Thompson goes on to add that the anti-Asian sentiment was circulating in the United States as early as the 1850s, immediately after the Chinese began to arrive in the mainland U.S. The Chinese were perpetually considered foreigners and subhuman. Moreover, Chinatowns throughout the United States have historically been associated with disease and urban quarantines. Focusing on San Francisco Chinatown in particular, historian Mayan Shah states, quote, by 1880, the understanding of Chinatown as the site of filth, disease, and inhuman habitation had achieved a pervasiveness in public discourse as both scientific truth and common sense, end quote. Critic Susan Schweik writes that in 1867, the San Francisco Board of Supervisors began to quarantine the Chinese living in the cities because they were deemed as, quote, public health intrusions, end quote. 5 years later, California legislators restricted the entrance of Chinese people with disabilities, legislation that paved the way for the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. Chinatown in Los Angeles was also the site of quarantining disease in the early 20th century. Schweik adds, quote, reports of concentrations of disease in the Lower East Side or the Mexican Quarter or the Chinatown or the Little Italy of various cities reassured readers not only that disease came from somewhere else, but also that it could be segregated, end quote. In other words, the point of quarantining the discursively diseased Chinese in ethnic ghettos like Chinatown was to bolster white supremacy, to reassure white Americans that Chinese foreign disease could not become native to the whites in the United States. Also, the absence of voices of Asian American women, let alone Chinese American women during the 19th century, did not refute and actually supported the discourse surrounding their universal occupation as syphilitic prostitutes that ultimately led to the Page Act of 1875. The objectifying discourse of the yellow peril model minority that led to the legislated and physical lynchings of Chinese Americans supported and legitimized the equally objectifying discourse of the ruling white supremacy in the 19th century U.S. The study contributes to the work of scholarship by Colleen Lai and Robert G. Lee that argue that the binary discourses of the yellow peril and the model minority emerged historically in tandem with each other. Examining late 19th to mid 20th century literature, Lai works against the long-standing historical interpretation that the yellow peril emerged in the 19th century, whereas the model minority came about during the civil rights era of the 20th century. She argues, quote, "But the yellow peril and model minority are best understood as two aspects of the same long-running racial form, a form whose most salient feature, whether it has been made the basis for exclusion or assimilation, is the trope of economic efficiency," unquote. Lee diagrams the trope of Asian American economic efficiency as, quote, "the pollutant, the coolie, the deviant, the yellow peril, the model minority, and the gook," end quote, in his claim that these, quote, 6 images historically portray the Oriental as an Asian or alien body and a threat to the American national family, end quote. According to Lee and Lai, the Oriental or the Asiatic, respectively, contributed to white supremacy by contrast. But where did the coincident stereotypes of the yellow peril and the model minority of the United States come from? This essay offers a genealogical snapshot of some of its origins during the early Asian exclusion era in the late 19th century. When I was preparing for this talk, Ted Gong had asked, as I was doing research, if there was a Donald Trumpian figure during the smallpox epidemics of 1868, 1876, 1880, and 1887 in San Francisco. In my research on the smallpox epidemics, I couldn't find one, but I did find one during the bubonic plague in San Francisco in 1900, for which Chinese and Japanese were also blamed, and which sealed off Chinatown from the rest of the city. So that was the California's Governor Henry Gage. During the plague, California Governor Henry Gage accused federal authorities of overreacting to the epidemic and inducing panic at a national level. Joseph Kenyon, the founder of the Hygienic Laboratory, which turned into the National Institutes of Health, was placed in charge by Surgeon General Wyman of treating the bubonic plague in San Francisco through the Marine Hospital Service. Although Kenyon went along with the quarantine of Chinatown, he warned Surgeon General Wyman against, quote, "overly stringent public health measures," unquote, because he felt that the enforced aggressive quarantine was unconstitutional, and because he understood the epidemiology of the plague and focused his efforts on killing rats and vermin instead of quarantine and isolation. As Shaw points out, the bubonic plague in San Francisco in 1900, as has the current coronavirus pandemic, exposed the rift between scientific knowledge and government strategies. Despite Kenyon's expertise in the plague epidemiology, Governor Gage accused Kenyon of, quote, "malicious intent," declaring plague a ruse concocted by Kenyon and the San Francisco Board of Health to blackmail the city for public health funds, end quote. The press called Dr. Kenyon, quote, "stupid and malignant," end quote, and declared the plague fake, just as the current truthers called the numbers of COVID-19 cases fabricated. Governor Gage eventually removed Kenyon from the Marine Hospital Service, which took over the quarantine, as he accused Kenyon of importing and spreading the plague by implanting the plague bacteria in cadavers. The smallpox epidemic of 1868, eventually blamed on the Chinese in San Francisco, is also one such historical accident that gave rise to the yellow peril in the 19th century US. There were smallpox outbreaks in 1868, 1876, 1880, and 1887 in San Francisco, and the disease was discursively believed to racially originate with the Chinese and Chinese Americans. Quote, "after the 1869 smallpox epidemic, the San Francisco Board of Supervisors required the quarantine and physical inspection of passengers and cargo from Asia." Chinese immigrants began arriving in the mainland US in the late 1840s to seek a living from the gold rush in the Sierra foothills. The number of Chinese immigrants grew from 2,716 in 1851 to 20,026 in 1852. By 1867, 12,000 Chinese were working for the Central Pacific Railroad, a necessary structure following the gold rush. In the 1850s, the Chinese were viewed as the model minority and were, quote, "admired for their industry and frugality," end quote. The Chinese composed 90% of the railroad's workforce. When the railroad was completed in 1869, Chinese railroad workers migrated to the nearest major city, San Francisco, with hopes of finding further employment. By 1870, the number of Chinese living in San Francisco was over 12,000, and by 1882, the number was around 30,000. Historian Joan Trauner writes, quote, by the 1870s, the racist argument had broadened in scope, and the Chinese were viewed as, quote, a social, moral, and political curse to the community, unquote, or the Yellow Peril. The Chinese were the largest racial minority group in California at the time, and during these latter decades of the century, San Francisco had the largest population of Chinese in California, about 24.4% of the state's total population of Chinese. For this reason, the Chinese became what Trauner calls easy, quote, medical scapegoats, unquote, as well as economic scapegoats by white labor unions during the recession of 1875. The White Working Men's Party of California, or the WPC, was an anti-Chinese labor organization that blamed the Chinese for recession and rising white poverty rates. An examination of the actual facts of the smallpox epidemics in San Francisco will demonstrate that the Chinese were indeed medical and economic scapegoats. Public health historian Susan Craddock notes that immediately following the first smallpox epidemic of 1868, there was very little anti-Chinese rhetoric blaming the Chinese for the epidemic. She states that one physician at the time even suggested that the smallpox could have come from Europe instead of Asia. However, only a year after the epidemic, and despite later urging of newspapers to refrain from blaming the Chinese as the source for the smallpox epidemic, the Chinese became, quote, targeted from their supposed disease-breeding habits, unquote. By the second smallpox epidemic in 1876, it was common discourse to trace the source of the smallpox epidemic to the Chinese living in San Francisco. With each successive epidemic, there were fewer total deaths. The mortality rates were the following. In 1868, 760 died out of a population of 150,000. In 1876, 482 died out of 300,000. In 1880, there were 92 deaths. In 1887, there were 69 deaths. Of the smallpox cases and deaths, the number of Chinese with smallpox was relatively minute. For example, during the 1876 epidemic, only 60 of the 16,000 were Chinese. Even though Chinatown was the focus of quarantine and fumigation during the second epidemic. Explaining the smallpox epidemic, which spread like the coronavirus through droplets in the air, was actually caused by the poor state of San Francisco's street sewage system, which did not discriminate between race and class. Craddock attributes the discursive phenomenon of scapegoating the Chinese through the smallpox epidemic to the location of Chinatown. Whereas the sections of the city where poorer whites lived, like the South of Market District, could be altogether avoided by white and upper middle class whites, Chinatown was located in the center of the city. Craddock writes, quote, it was much more inconvenient to circumambulate an area in the middle of the city. Conversely, it was impossible for those exiting Chinatown to avoid contact with white residents while transcending the city on their way to jobs, end quote. So you can see Chinatown is sort of right in the middle of the downtown San Francisco. Located in the physical heart of the city and scapegoated as the source of smallpox, the Chinese were beloved as the model minority and hated as the Yellow Peril for their industry and foreignness. These paradoxical stereotypes and discourses led to anti-Chinese organizations, legislation, and hate crimes against Chinese in the 19th century. Organized in 1869, the Anti-Coolie Association replicated the discourse of Chinese disease from the 1868 smallpox outbreak by publicly delineating the threat of the Chinese laborer posed to the working force and health of white Americans. Likewise, shortly after the massacre of 1871, an anti-Coolie club was organized by Native white Americans of Los Angeles. The massacre of 1871, in which 18 Chinese men were lynched by hanging in the Chinatown district of LA, counters any seemingly innocuous model minority portrayals of Chinese Americans during the 19th century. While viewed as the diseased Yellow Peril, which was fueled by the discourse in the aftermath of the 1868 smallpox epidemic in San Francisco, the Chinese were persecuted for their model minority industriousness as cheap labor. Meanwhile, some African Americans in Los Angeles problematically made distinctions between, quote, the pagan foreigners, end quote, and themselves based on their own American citizenship, military service, and Christian faith. The Chinese in California and in the United States more broadly were discursively labeled as a diseased heathen menace to society that threatened the American working class by providing cheap labor. Through his archival research, historian Scott Zesch provides some of the comments of the lynch mob members after the mass hanging. The shoemaker A.R. Johnston, head of the mob, stated, quote, the cheap labor is done away with now. The sons of bitches are hanged, end quote. Johnston's statement about the Chinese model minority yellow peril, cheap labor, that is ultimately lynched exemplifies theorist Giorgio Agamben's claim about the necessarily, quote, killed but not sacrificed, end quote, homo sacer. Quote, the exception is a kind of exclusion, end quote, to perpetuate white supremacy. Less than 2 hours after the massacre occurred, an unnamed member of the lynching party stated, quote, I am satisfied now. I have killed 3 Chinamen, end quote. The mass lynching of the 18 Chinese men suggests that their discursive subjectification as cheap labor reduced them to objects that were disposable. The county coroner, Joseph Kurtz, ordered an investigation of the murders. 2 weeks after Kurtz's inquest, the county court judge, Ignacio Sepulveda, organized a special grand jury to investigate and try the members of the lynch mob. Of the 27 people who had warrants out for their arrest, only 10 men were tried, and none of them were sentenced for the crime of murder. 7 of the 10 men were given sentences of 3 to 6 years at San Quentin State Prison. Other Chinese men, such as Sam Yuan, the Chinese organization Ninyang's leader, was tried for the death of a white man, Robert Thompson, during this massacre, but was discharged. When L.F. Curly Crenshaw was tried for the manslaughter of Jean Tong, he was found guilty, but only as an accessory to murder, which resulted in a 3-year sentence at San Quentin. Zesch states that the verdict of Crenshaw's guilt, quote, was also a huge relief to everyone, nearly everyone, but Curly Crenshaw, for it meant that Los Angeles was to be spared from further denigration in the national press the next day, end quote. While the lynching of 18 Chinese men suggested their discursive objectification as disposable bodies would secure white supremacy, the racial superlative of whiteness embodied by the lynch mob needed to be quickly renounced. After all, it exposed to the objectification of white supremacy, when in fact the white Americans of the lynch mob and the lynched Chinese Americans were equally human. Agamben writes of sovereign violence, which preserves sovereignty like white supremacy, quote, the violence exercised in the state of exception clearly neither preserves nor simply posits law, but rather conserves it in suspending it and posits in accepting itself from it, end quote. That is, normative white supremacy in the U.S. needed to accept itself from the lynch mob of the massacre of 1871 in order to conserve its sovereign violence to wield whenever it pleased. But according to sovereign power, a term used by Agamben, and violence, the pervasive discourse of white supremacy during the 19th century objectified Chinese men as diseased, cheap labor, while also differently objectifying Chinese women as prostitutes. Chinese tongs or cultural organizations dealt in the sex trade by imposing import fees on indentured Chinese women who were forced to immigrate and brought to work in brothels against their wills. The Chinese themselves were partly responsible for the forced prostitution of Chinese women and the universalizing discourse of Chinese females as prostitutes. Zesch writes, quote, from the time Chinese women first arrived on the West Coast, they were regularly maligned in the American press. California newspapers perpetuated the widely held belief that the majority, if not all, of the Chinese women who came to the United States had been brought for the purposes of prostitution. To some extent, Chinese men fostered the stereotype when they spoke to reporters. Quote, the Chinese laugh at the absurdity of supposing that any of their countrywomen of respectable position ever came here, end quote, reported one journalist, end quote. Of course, not all Chinese women who arrived in the United States in the 19th century were prostitutes. Many were dispatched wives of Chinese laborers. Zesch writes that when some Chinese women were coerced into immigrating for the purposes of prostitution problematically, quote, women of uncommon beauty, pedigree, or charm were taken as wives or girlfriends when they arrived in America, whereas those who went to work in brothels tended to be plain peasant girls, end quote. In fact, in the 1850s and 1860s, all Chinese females over the age of 12 were considered prostitutes by police in cities like San Francisco and Los Angeles. Sex with Chinese females was blamed for the transmission of syphilis and the feminization of white men. Leprosy was also seen on the Pacific coast as a Chinese disease, and was understood by the public as, quote, simply the result of generations of syphilis transmitted from one generation to another, end quote. Between 1871 and 1890, 83 Mongolian, quote unquote, Mongolian lepers were shipped from San Francisco to China. Moreover, 4 years after the massacre of 1871, the Page Act specifically barred Chinese laborer spouses and the immigration of single Chinese women, preventing the formation of heterosexual families among Chinese immigrants, since interracial marriage was outlawed in Maryland since 1661, and specifically outlawed for Asians and whites in California in 1850. The legal discourse of the Page Act deliberately perpetuated the universalizing image of Chinese women as prostitutes when it stated, quote, "Be it enacted by the Senate and House of Representatives of the United States of America and Congress assembled, that in determining whether the immigration of any subject of China, Japan, or any Oriental country to the United States is free and voluntary, it shall be the duty of the Consul General or Consul of the United States residing at the port from which it is proposed to convey such subjects, to ascertain whether such immigrant has entered into a contract or agreement for a term of service within the United States for lewd or immoral purposes. And if there be such contract or agreement, the said Consul General or Consul shall not deliver the required permit or certificate." The depiction of, quote, "any subject of China, Japan, or any Oriental country who has entered into a contract of agreement for lewd and immoral purposes," end quote, was specifically directed at Asian American women who were thought not to be respectable even if they were married. Even though women were not physically lynched during the massacre of 1871, the Page Act socially executed them as hypersexualized pariahs. Asian American women in the 19th century did not represent themselves. In this way, they were truly subaltern. Their objectification as prostitutes were represented by the lynching legal discourse of the Page Act. The discourse of the Yellow Peril, which encompasses the model minority and the objectification of Asian American women as hypersexual prostitutes, has multiple origins, according to Thompson. This essay traces its genealogy to the events of the early exclusion era, in which Asians were blamed for urban epidemics, anti-Asian organizations such as the Anti-Coolie Association were created, and Asians were lynched both literally and figuratively through legal discourse. Scapegoating Asians, specifically the Chinese in the 19th century, as Schweik points out, supported the fallacy that, quote, "public space, white space, citizen space could be cordoned off from the danger of contagion and sound, smell, and sight of disease, all of which were carried flagrantly by the intruding, uncontained, unsightly foreign beggar," end quote. The events of the early exclusion era reinforced the objectivity and disposability of Asian American bodies, but also performed the divine violence of partially exposing the seemingly invisible, perfect, supreme bodies of the white American lynch mobs, anti-Asian organizers, and legislators as also objects. That is to say, white supremacy itself is paradoxically objectifying and inevitably undermines itself. This revelation, as crises such as global pandemics often do, sheds light on the indisputable fact that all races are susceptible to disease and quarantine. In short, we are all human. Thank you.
Thank you for that presentation, Audrey. I think we're going to turn it over to Yilin now, who is going to introduce our panelists, and then our other panelists, Dr. Janelle Wong and Dr. Adrian Poon, will have their comments.
Thank you, Susan, and thank you, Dr. Clark, for that very rich and insightful presentation. And thank you, everyone, for tuning in on this Friday. My name is Yilin Zhang, and I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Wong and Dr. Poon for the next part of this conversation. And just to encourage everyone, thank you for the engagement on the chat box. And if you have questions as we're conversing, please feel free to put your question in the chat box, because it will be an interactive discussion and I'll be tying in some of the questions into the discussion. So a quick note, housekeeping item about what's coming up. I'm going to take the next couple of minutes to introduce Dr. Wong and Dr. Poon, and then we're going to move into introductory comments from Dr. Wong and Dr. Poon. And then for about 15 minutes or so, we'll have a conversation, and that's when I'll be integrating some of our audience's questions. So without further ado, I'd like to start with Dr. Janelle Wong. Dr. Wong received her PhD from the Department of Political Science at Yale University. She holds a joint position in the Departments of American Studies and Government and Politics at the University of Maryland. Dr. Wong is the author of Immigrants, Evangelicals, and Politics in an Era of Demographic Change, Democracy's Promise, Immigrants, and American Civic Institutions, and co-author of 2 books on Asian American politics. Dr. Wong served as co-principal investigator on the 2016 National Asian American Survey. And now I'd like to introduce Dr. Poon. Dr. Adrian Poon is an assistant professor of medicine at the George Washington University School of Medicine and Health Sciences. She holds a Master of Public Health from Drexel University with a concentration in health management and policy focused on systemic, racial, and ethnic health disparities, in particular, Asian American health. She previously worked as an ASPH CDC fellow to support the global HIV/AIDS response in Beijing, China. And Dr. Poon is an active community member and serves as the VP of Public Affairs for the DC chapter of OCA-APA Advocates. So welcome again, Dr. Wong and Dr. Poon. And so I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Wong, and I see she has a presentation pulled up. So we'll just give it 1 minute, and Dr. Wong, I'll pass it to you for your opening remarks.
Thank you so much, Yilin, and thank you to Dr. Wu Clark for that really wonderful presentation. And I always enjoy listening to your work. It was really fascinating. So I just want to take us from kind of that historical context and come back around to the present day. As Dr. Wu Clark mentioned, this has been a time where we've seen the pandemic racialized, including from the highest levels of government. And this, I think, raises some questions about how those racialized ideas are circulating through the larger population. So there's some interesting research on this. This is a study by The Hill and shows that the vast majority, this was done over the summer, the vast majority of Americans do believe that the term Kung flu or terms like the China virus are in fact inappropriate. So you can see 66% believe that those terms are inappropriate. At the same time, this kind of racialization became highly politicized. And so on the one hand, you see that Republicans are much more likely than Democrats to say that the term is appropriate, those kinds of terms. But it's also true that 17% of Democrats also believe those terms are appropriate. And one of the things that I think is critical to understand is the real transformation that the Asian American community is experiencing in terms of demographics, internal demographics. And so this issue is not only affecting those who are thought to be Chinese, but as we've seen that it's affecting people across different ethnic groups within the Asian American community. Some of the most high profile cases of racial targeting and anti-Asian bias have been issued towards people who are outside of China. And this is, I think, kind of points to outside of Chinese heritage. And this points to really the transformation within the Asian American community. So while East Asians sort of dominate the media and public imagination, when people think about Asian American communities, I think it's just a good reminder to see these statistics that show that East Asians, people from China, Korea, Japan, are actually a minority of the larger Asian American community. Today, the bulk of the community is actually South Asian and Southeast Asian. Here we see these, many of you have seen these statistics, but I think it's also worth reminding people that the kind of racialized experiences that Asian Americans have are also tied to the racism that other groups face. And you can see here that both Asian Americans and Black Americans have been more likely to report negative experiences around the coronavirus. So you can see here that they report the highest levels with this particular kind of racial context that we've experienced as a result of the pandemic. And of course, this is true of mask wearing as well. One of the things that my colleagues and I have been doing is surveying Asian Americans, and we do these surveys with different national origin groups and in different languages. And so this is a survey that was conducted over the summer with Asian American voters. And you can see here that the worry about experiencing hate crimes or anti-Asian bias as a result of COVID-19 are very high across different segments of the Asian American population. And a majority of Asian Americans do worry about experiencing such kind of targeting. Note here, though, that Chinese are not who have been specifically mentioned as part of the terminology around the virus, are not the group that necessarily is most worried. In fact, we see that Asian Indians are the most worried. And so again, this points to the kind of diffuse effects, but still powerful effects of anti-Asian bias in the US. I'll also note, and this was really poignant and remarkable, I think, in the way in which people stood up for Asian Americans. So we saw that Black and the Black and Latino caucuses in Congress, the leadership of those caucuses were the first to really step up and condemn anti-Asian bias. This showed, I think, a really important level of solidarity. We also saw, civil rights leaders across the country, from the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, from the NAACP, from UNIDOS, standing up in a really public way and to condemn anti-Asian bias. And I think this is really important because this was happening exactly at the same time as Asian Americans were sort of front and center in some contestation and opposition to important policies to create equality, to move the needle on educational equity, especially for Black and Latino communities. So there was this kind of stark contrast in some ways that was really disappointing to me, that Asian Americans were actually kind of pushing back against civil rights gains for especially Black communities, when in fact those communities were standing up for Asian Americans at the highest levels of government. And this, is an interesting kind of note to consider. I think that while Asian Americans as a whole do support affirmative action, so this is part of, I think, the larger political and racial context, we also see that the group that has been least supportive among Asian Americans are Chinese Americans. And so there are some, I think, issues going forward that will really need to require reflection among Asian Americans. Finally, we see, and these are from the data that I presented, that although the vast majority of Asian Americans supported the Democratic candidate in the election, and this has been true since Clinton years, we have seen that Asian Americans have consistently, a majority have voted for the Democratic candidate since the late or mid 1990s. We also see that there is a core among Asian Americans that did support Trump, despite the fact that Trump was using these kind of racialized terms to describe the virus. And so I think we're seeing this kind of both rejection of that anti-Asian bias, we are seeing a kind of recognition of it, and we're also seeing a willingness to overlook it. And I'll end there, and we can talk more about some of these political dynamics and racial dynamics within the Asian American community. Thank you so much, Yilin.
Thank you, Dr. Wong, for sharing that very interesting statistics, and hopefully we have some time to discuss a little further. And I want to now pass to Dr. Adrian Poon and invite her to provide some introductory remarks. Dr. Poon? Okay, great. Looks like we have a presentation, so we'll just give it a minute. Dr. Poon, can you hear us?
Oh, hello, can you hear me?
Perfect, yes.
Okay, great. Yeah, I just wanted to sort of build off of what Dr. Wu Clark and Dr. Wong discussed in their fantastic presentations, and talk a little bit more about anti-Asian racism in the time of COVID-19. So a major misconception is that people of Asian descent, such as Chinese Americans, were more likely to get and spread COVID-19 than other Americans. This is simply not true. COVID-19 is a highly infectious disease that is transmissible by droplets through the air and contact between human beings. The World Health Organization created the name COVID-19 to avoid reference to any particular region or its people, given concerns of stigma. Misperceptions, as well as terminology, including the using the Chinese or Wuhan virus and Kung flu, unfortunately, has led to an alarming rise in racially motivated attacks on Asian Americans, as well as a climate of many community members living in fear of being attacked. An alarming example of these hate crimes includes the racially motivated stabbing of a Burmese American man and his 2 children, ages 2 and 6, because the attacker thought that they were Chinese and infecting people with the coronavirus. There have been other reports of Asian Americans being verbally assaulted, spit on, sprayed with Febreze even. Some Asian Americans who have been following the news in Asia remember living through the SARS epidemic, had adopted the preventive measure of wearing masks early on in the COVID-19 epidemic in the US. Although this measure may have helped prevent infections in the community, people wearing masks also reported being attacked or alienated, which raised fear around adopting this preventive practice. This is some news articles that I found, sort of current events. This one, published November 12th, reported a New Jersey chiropractor office listing a sign specifically noting this time period of the Chinese virus. And some of the other headlines around that. I don't want anyone calling my kid coronavirus. People getting spit on, yelled at, and the fear that people are living in. This is another event that was also published this week in DC, but a shop owner in, I think, around DuPont Circle got pepper sprayed by someone shouting racist and Chinese taunts. And it's just the latest incident, but there's been multiple that this shop owner has been experiencing since he opened his shop back in February. And there's, a major impact of this. Pew Research Center did a great study, and one of their findings is about 4 in 10 Americans say it's more common for people to express racist views about people who are Asian than before COVID-19. Sadly, these hate crimes are occurring in the setting of a historical context that includes some of the discriminatory laws and policies heard earlier in this panel and stereotypes that Chinese are more likely to be diseased. During the 1900 bubonic plague, for example, the San Francisco Department of Health overnight quarantined about 30,000 Chinese Americans in Chinatown with barbed wires and ropes, allowed free travel for white citizens in their stereotyped and inaccurate assumption. So some pictures of San Francisco, Chinatown on the right from that period. On the left is what happened in Oahu Chinatown in Hawaii, where the Board of Health was concerned that it was due to Chinese people, and they decided that they were going to burn any buildings that had inhabitants that were of Chinese descent. They even had the military enforcing a quarantine and this burn, and it got out of control and destroyed about 38 acres of Chinatown in that period. So there is also, as we've heard from some of our other speakers, a long historical context of this. And there wasn't the understanding at the time that really the bubonic plague was carried by rats, and that people were in these communities in Chinatown, a certain level of racial segregation and neighborhood segregation that forced a lot of the Chinese community to live in crowded quarters in less desirable areas of these cities that increased the risk of spread, and with poor building management that allowed infestations of rats to grow. So in the recent climate of fear around the epidemic, several organizations, including the Chinese for Affirmative Action and the Asian Pacific Planning and Policy Council, which are based in California, created reporting systems that have reported more than well over 2,000 reports of hate related speech or incidents since the COVID-19 epidemic. This is sort of a sample of their reporting website online, where the incident reports can be put into various different languages for different races, ethnicities, or for various Asian American groups. This is sort of, when you fill it in, it brings you to this Google form that can be filled out. And this is sort of some of the results that they had from the period of March 19th to August 5th. And they analyzed the type of language that was used in some of this Asian, anti-Chinese hate, but 60.4% of incidents were related to virulent animosity, 23.2% related to scapegoating of China, 19.4% anti-immigrant nativism, 18.4% racist characterizations of Chinese, and 14.2% of related to racial slurs. Congresswoman Grace Meng introduced a House resolution to document reports of hate crimes, incidents, and threats against Asian Americans in order to allow for investigations, which was passed in September. Unfortunately, in response to her trying to put out this resolution, she received a number of racist voicemails for getting this bill passed through the House. One thing I wanted to touch upon is the COVID epidemic and health disparities associated with it that are largely unrecognized, especially amongst groups, Pacific Islanders, Filipino Americans. Here's one headline, was discussing how Pacific Islanders in the US are hospitalized with COVID-19 up to 10 times higher than other groups. And some of the factors related to this is large families, high rates of cardiovascular disease, hypertension, diabetes, obesity, a lot of people working on the frontline service industries that all increase risk of exposure. Another recent headline that deserves more exploration is that Asian Americans are facing high COVID-19 case fatality, which means that once they've been diagnosed, that they're more likely to die. And some of the reasons need to be explored further, but there's fear of going out and getting tested because of stigma. A lot of people are immigrants in the community and may not have eligibility for healthcare services and therefore avoid healthcare system unless they're really sick. And then some of these working on the front line, service industries, and the large family units are also other risk factors. But I think that this is really an important issue that needs to be looked into further. There's a Pacific Island health response team that's been set up with health experts across the country trying to explore, for example, the rates of COVID-19 amongst this group. I mean, despite all this fear, hysteria, and targeting, members of the Asian American community have rallied around making donations of medical supplies to hospitals to protect healthcare workers, including in the local DMV area. I think this sends a strong message that we in the Asian American community are part of the fabric of America and are making these contributions to support this country's response to the epidemic. And this type of effort is something that both 1882 Foundation and OCA-DC have engaged in. And I think it really shows the strong level of community resilience and willing to support the epidemic, support healthcare workers. I mean, I appreciated the donations that came to us at GW for the masks and other supplies that we are using here. And I think that it also sends a message that a large part of the Asian American, Chinese American community feel like we, this is our home, this is our country, and we also are doing what we can to contribute and make a difference here. And despite the anti-Asian hate that the community has experienced, I think that says a lot. That's all I had. I'll hand it back to Yilin.
Thank you so much, Dr. Poon. We've had 3 great presentations by Dr. Clark, Dr. Wong, and Dr. Poon. And we're running, we have about 5 minutes for our conversation. So I'll try to keep this very efficient and then we'll move into our next portion. But I just want to say that we've had a great insight into the history and also seeing how that's applicable in present state with the COVID-19 pandemic, and having the perspectives of Dr. Wong from the politics and her work in studying the Asian American population, and also Dr. Poon as a active practicing physician, I think is very insightful. So I want to start integrating some audience questions just because we're a little short on time. From an action perspective, we have a question from the audience about how did the Asian American population rise above the systemic racism in San Francisco in the 1850s to 1860s. And I want to take that a little bit further in saying, how can we rise above the systemic racism now, and what can not just us, but all of our community do to make sure that we don't condone this behavior toward any identity? So I want to start with Dr. Clark and see if you're still there. I know with everyone on Zoom. Oh, you're on mute.
Yes, I'm still here. I'm sorry
Okay.
about that. My computer was freezing on me, unfortunately.
No worries. I get that all the time too. So did you hear my question about?
Can you repeat it again? I'm
Yes.
sorry, Yilin.
So the systemic racism, how did Asian Americans rise above that or fight against that in the 1850s in San Francisco? And I think that's also applicable now, is what can we do from an action perspective?
Unfortunately, in the 1850s and 1860s, there was very little Asian American consciousness. Asian American pan-ethnic consciousness did not come about until literature in the late 19th century, early 20th century, where there was any kind of notion that, hey, we're racialized in the same way, and therefore we should sort of band together. In the 1850s, the few Japanese laborers that there were and the Chinese laborers were actually pitted against each other, unfortunately. And so it was actually actually there was not a sense of community within the Asian American community.
Thank you. Let's go to Dr. Wong.
Yeah, I think what changed most for the treatment of Asian Americans in the U.S. Is really U.S. immigration laws. So as the U.S. started to relax bans and recruit more highly educated Asian Americans, we saw the mass public's view of Asian Americans change dramatically. And that's something that I think Dr. Wu Clark did mention, that, you know, we went from this kind of despised disease-carrying minority to the model minority. And that's really a result of changes in US immigration law that had the biggest effect on views towards our community.
Thank you. Dr. Poon?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, the views of our community have changed throughout time. And I think there's an interesting, you know, jumping off of that immigration law, different perspectives based on generation of it, because a lot of people here now have immigrated since the immigration law change in 1965 and may not be aware of this historical racism there's such this long history of it. A lot of people are often surprised when I try to bring it up or tell them, and you know, then this idea of a model minority, that the Asian community doesn't face racism, doesn't have face challenges or issues, I think are ongoing challenges that we all face. And raising awareness is really important as a result, and doing these types of talks and presentations is really important because just a lot of people don't know this history.
Yeah, absolutely. And systemic racism is something that is systemic, has been with us for a very long time, generations. And just an example with the right to vote for women, Black women, Asian American women, Native American women didn't get the right to vote until quite a bit later, into the 1940s to 1965. So 40 to 60, about 20 to 40 some years after Caucasian women got the right to vote in this country. So I think having this history mindset is just a good foundation for us to know and move forward. And I'm curious about why you're passionate about this work and how you got involved. And just to set the stage for myself, working in healthcare, the reason why I got involved was because I recognize that access to healthcare information has a big impact on people's healthcare outcomes. So if you experience a language barrier in the work that I was doing, that has a significant effect on how positive your health can be. So I want to end by that overall question of just asking, how did you start in your work and why are you passionate about carrying this work forward? So we'll start with Dr. Wong.
I got very interested just because I grew up during a time where there were not very many Asian American elected officials. I had worked on campaigns and was thinking about running for office, and then I realized, wait, I don't think I could win office. I'm Asian American, and so I got very interested in just political representation in Asian Americans.
Thank you, Dr. Poon.
I got interested just having grown up and experienced a certain level of anti-Asian racism towards myself and people in the community, especially post 9/11. Growing up in Jersey, we saw this huge rise in hate incidents, and a lot of my friends and their families living in fear. And I think that stimulated me to get involved with the Asian American organizations in college and in grad school, and why I did master's work in Asian American health disparities, trying to link this to my career, and why I sort of re-engaged with OCA here in DC, and have been actively involved with them, because I just feel like there's so much to do, and that can be done. So, you know, I think it's an important part of civic engagement. Is just an important piece of what we can contribute to our society.
Thank you. And Dr. Clark?
My first love was literature. I was an English major at Cornell, and I was also an Asian American Studies minor. And what struck me was that, you know, Asian American literature seemed to only be in the late 20th century, but I knew Asian Americans had been around in the United States for almost a century before them. And so I was focusing on modernism, and I wanted to recover Asian American modernists as an undergraduate, and I didn't have the tools to do so. So that's when I went to graduate school and studied Asian American modernism. And what really fascinated me about these writers was that they were writing during a period of Asian exclusion, right? That they were told that they couldn't become American citizens. And so it was just, you know, writing under those conditions was just such an inspiration to me. And so that's what my first book was on eventually. And I really just admire these champions for the community.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So Susan, I don't know if we have time for one more question. We do have quite a few questions, and thank you everyone for your engagement. I was hoping to take one more of these audience questions.
Yes, Kyle has generously sacrificed his segment on the Asian Literature Corner. So yes, please continue with audience questions. Okay,
thank you so much, Susan. Thank you, Kyle. So one of the questions that we had from our audience members was, have we seen with the history of Asian Americans and now COVID-19, an example was the Spanish flu. Did we see similar types of behavior toward a specific community? And I think I'll start with Dr. Clark to see if you might be able to answer that question.
From what I don't know a lot about the Spanish flu, but what I've heard is that African Americans were unfortunately targeted during this time, in part because you know, it was post-Reconstruction. A lot of them were you know, not sort of well off and economically empowered, and so a lot of them fell prey to kind of poor living conditions, and so they were easily scapegoated as kind of like perpetuators of the disease.
Thank you. And Dr. Wong or Dr. Poon, would you like to add anything to that? Okay, great. So this question relates a little bit to all your presentations, and also Dr. Poon, I saw your slide about what happened to one of the small businesses in DC in DuPont Circle just this week, which I also saw and started talking about. But this particular question is, are we able to share, or have you seen or experienced specific COVID-19 impacts related to the Asian American community in the DC area? So we'll start with Dr. Poon.
I mean, overall, there's definitely been cases of it. I think more in Maryland, Virginia, but you know, I felt like because a lot of the community had been aware of COVID following developments in Asia, where people have families and friends, and a lot of people just wore masks fairly early on, and I think that helped contribute to not as alarming health disparities as we've seen in some of the other communities. You know, but I think, you know, for everyone, it's going to be an ongoing challenge, as you know, I think family units are a very important part of the community, and as we move towards winter and people wanting to gather in larger groups, we just have to maintain vigilance to help try to keep the rates low. as much as possible. I think when people get really sick, especially if they have limited insurance, oftentimes we'll see them in the hospital.
Thank you. Dr. Wong, any comments?
Yeah, I think, I mean, the COVID pandemic has really just brought to the fore these enduring inequalities and created new inequalities. And so even though we've seen Asian Americans as a whole outpace white communities in terms of income and education in the past, you know, there have been some more specific studies now that show that there's now starting to be a gap in unemployment and in accessing unemployment insurance, where Asian Americans are starting to drop below whites in terms of economic security. And that's really partly a result of this pandemic. And it's much, much more severe for other communities, especially Black, Latinx, and Indigenous communities. So we're just seeing this pandemic just create this slice of, you know, almost unrecoverable in some ways inequality that we have to pay attention to now.
Thank you. Dr. Clark?
I have nothing more to add to that answer.
Thank you. So the next question I'm going to combine together, but the question is, have we seen the broader APIA community affected, or even outside the APIA community affected by the viral racism? Someone had mentioned the Filipino community. Is this something that we're seeing across the country? And I guess anyone can take this question, but I'll start with Dr. Wong to see if you have a comment on that. You're on mute.
So I think this actually should go to Dr. Poon, because in terms of, you know, Dr. Poon had mentioned frontline workers, and I think that's the question is going really towards that, the ways in which healthcare workers, frontline workers are being affected.
Great. Dr. Poon?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say that there, and partly this relates to the immigration laws and the prioritization of people in certain fields, but there are a lot of Asian Americans, Pacific Islanders working in as frontline workers in healthcare and in services industries like your restaurants and groceries, and that type of work can put people at greater risk, and with a significant psychological, social impact of doing this work. You know, I mean, I can say personally that, you know, having been taking care of COVID patients since all of this began, and just managing something that we've never seen before, it has been probably one of the scariest things that I've ever done. And, you know, I think we've done, you know, a fantastic job, especially in DC, in trying to keep the rates low, which make it overall on a community level safer for all of us in this field. I mean, I think other impacts on the community are just the general stereotyping that occurs, you know, because, and, you know, a lot of, you know, we talk a lot about like the Chinese community, but I think I've mentioned like different hate crimes, like, you know, say the Burmese American family that occurred, like your attacker or whoever is performing or doing this aggression or microaggression, they're not going to look at you and know what your ethnicity is. They're not going to care. They are going to look at you and stereotype. And I think that puts everyone in the community at a certain level of risk, you know, and the general lack of awareness that the Asian American community faces racism and stereotyping, and that harm can come from it. You know, I was alarmed a few months ago. One of the patients I was taking care of and had worked really hard with my team to do a good job in coordinating Karen just sort of offhandedly before leaving the hospital just mentioned this China virus floating around. And it was just sort of a personal moment of horror for me to, and the realization that he had no idea that this was something that was really hurting his Chinese American physician. And it wasn't because he wasn't appreciative either. It's just that people don't understand and don't, think. And I think that relates back to the model minority myth. And this idea that we don't have disparities in community, we don't experience these disparities. And I think that's also why it's important to highlight the disparities where they are. As I mentioned, the higher rates in specifically Pacific Islanders, and just to be vigilant about that and support how we can these efforts.
Thank you very much, Dr. Poon. And we are actually right on time. I want to thank everyone for your questions, and I apologize that we did not get to all of them, but the questions, if our panelists are still online for a little bit, they're in the Q&A box, some in the chat box. And I want to pass to Susan, but she did post a very nice comment in the chat box. In addition to our timeless echoes, we have other talk stories, and I'll pass it to her to wrap us up. So thank you again, everyone.
Yes, thank you to all, and thank you to Ted, Yilin for your moderation, conference organizers. Kyle, I'm sorry we didn't get to your presentation, but thank you for being here. And thank you, of course, to all of our panelists. So we just hope that this panel has been informative and broadened your horizons with nuanced insights regarding the current state of the pandemic. And of course, the challenges and questions posed today have no easy answers, but we hope that you continue to grapple with them, struggle with why anti-Asian racism has emerged again, and more broadly, how we can situate movements for justice and solidarity in this historical context so that we can shed light on the present political moment. And we hope to sustain these conversations on racial justice and community for a long time to come. Thank you again for all in joining us in today's discussion, and to the conference for